The letter was thick and stiff, with a kind of self-importance, the kind of envelope that contains only bad news. I slid it open with a trembling thumb, my eyes scanning the dense, legalistic text. But I didn't need to read the whole thing. 2 words at the top, in bold, unforgiving print, screamed up at me. Notice of eviction. Eviction. From my cabin. From the only place that had felt like home since my wife passed, they were claiming I was an unauthorized occupant on a non-compliant property. They were giving me 30 days to vacate the premises before they would get a court order to have me forcibly removed. I stood there on my small, weathered porch, the gentle sound of the lake lapping against the shore, a cruel counterpoint to the roaring chaos in my head. Across the manicured cul-de-sac, I could see her, Cynthia, the president of the Water's Edge Estates Homeowners Association. She was on her pristine, perfect porch, watching me, a small, smug smile playing on her lips. She had done it. She was going to take my home. And that's when everything went wrong. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment. What would you do if this happened to you? And subscribe to HOA Files. To understand that eviction notice, you have to understand my grandfather. And you have to understand this lake. My name is Ben. For 40 years, my life was the quiet, ordered world of a historical archivist. I dealt in dusty records, faded maps, and the silent, forgotten stories of the past. My grandfather was a different sort of man. He was a shrewd, tough-as-nails businessman who had built a small fortune in the post-war boom, but his heart was always here at this lake. Decades ago, before all the development, he bought a huge tract of land on the quiet northern shore. His dream was to build a small family cabin, a place to escape the noise of the city. He built it himself, a simple, beautiful structure of stone and cedar on the best little point of land on the whole property. That cabin became the center of our family's world. I learned to fish off its small wooden dock, spent my summers there as a boy. It was where I proposed to my late wife, Sarah. After she passed last year, the cabin became my sanctuary, the only place I felt her presence, the only place the grief felt manageable over the years. To fund his retirement, my grandfather sold off most of the land, parcel by parcel, to a developer. That land became Water's Edge Estates, an exclusive, gated community of massive, modern lakefront homes. But he was clever, kept the 1-acre plot with his beloved cabin. And, as I would later discover, he kept a few other things as well. The new community was a world away from the simple, rustic life the cabin represented. It was a world of rules, of conformity, of an obsessive desire for a sterile, manicured perfection. And the absolute monarch of this new world was Cynthia. She was the HOA president, a woman who wielded the Book of Covenants like a holy text and ruled with an iron fist. From the very beginning, the humble cabin was a deep, personal affront to her. It was old. It was made of natural, unpainted wood. It had a slightly wild, unkempt garden of native plants that my wife had lovingly cultivated. In her eyes, it was a blight, an ugly scar on the face of her perfect, $1 million community. Our first real interaction set the tone for the war to come. I was on the porch, replacing a few weathered deck boards, a simple, quiet task. Cynthia marched up my path, not with a welcome basket, but with a thick, professionally bound copy of the HOA rulebook. "Hello," she'd said, her voice a mixture of forced cheerfulness and open condescension. "I'm Cynthia, the board president. We are all so thrilled to finally have a full-time resident in the old cabin. We've been so worried about it falling into disrepair. We've put together this welcome packet for you, which outlines all of the community's aesthetic standards and architectural guidelines. We're very much looking forward to you bringing the property up to code." She was handing me a list of rules for a club I wasn't a part of, and telling me to renovate the home my grandfather had built. "Thank you, Cynthia," I'd said, my voice tight. "But this property isn't actually part of the HOA. It was never incorporated." Her smile froze on her face. "That's a cute technicality," she said, her voice turning to ice. "But functionally, you are in our community, and we will expect you to behave as such." The war had been declared. The first notice arrived a week later, It was a formal, printed violation for my cabin's unapproved exterior color scheme, which was, of course, the natural weathered cedar wood it had been for 60 years. It also cited my non-compliant roofing material, the original sturdy tin roof my grandfather had installed. At first I was more annoyed than worried. It was a mistake, an overreach. I sent a polite registered letter back to the HOA board, along with a copy of my property deed and the original county plat map, clearly showing that my 1-acre parcel was separate and distinct from the Water's Edge Estates subdivision. I explained that I was not a member, not bound by their covenants, and that they had no jurisdiction over my property. Cynthia's response was to escalate. Another thicker envelope arrived, this time from the HOA's law firm. It was a long, rambling letter full of intimidating legal jargon, but the gist of it was this. They claimed that because my property was now geographically and aesthetically integrated into their community, and because I benefited from their private roads and security, I was therefore implicitly subject to its covenants and standards. They were, in essence, inventing a legal reality out of thin air to suit their agenda. The letter informed me that the fines for the violations were still accruing, now with added legal fees. This was no longer a simple mistake. This was a deliberate, malicious campaign of harassment. My peaceful retreat, my sanctuary of grief, had been turned into a battleground. I started to worry. I was a retired archivist on a fixed pension. I couldn't afford a protracted legal battle with an HOA that had a war chest funded by hundreds of wealthy homeowners in a small act of defiance. And to create a clear visual boundary, I decided to put up a simple, rustic split-rail fence along the edge of my property. Was tasteful, traditional, and well within my rights. Cynthia lost her mind. She showed up the day the first post was being set, her face a mask of purple rage. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked at the fencing contractor. "That is not an approved fencing material. It's hideous. It looks like something from a farm. You will stop this immediately." She stood in front of the post, hole digger physically blocking the work. I had to go out and threaten to call the sheriff for trespassing before she would retreat, spitting insults and threats as she went. The stress was becoming unbearable. I wasn't sleeping, felt a constant, low-grade anxiety, the feeling of being under siege in my own home. And then they dropped the bomb. Another certified letter. The HOA board, at an emergency meeting, had voted unanimously to place a lien on my property for the now thousands of dollars in unpaid, fraudulent fines and legal fees. The fear that hit me was cold and sharp. A lien that was real. That was a legal claim against my home. A lien could force a sale. They were going to take my house, my last connection to my wife, my last piece of my family's history, all because they didn't like the color of my roof. It felt like the walls were closing in, like there was no way out. Desperate. I did the only thing an old archivist knows how to do. I went to the records. In the dusty, cedar-scented attic of the cabin was my grandfather's old roll-top desk. Inside, I knew, was a leather portfolio containing all the original documents related to the property. I was looking for anything, any small detail, any forgotten clause that could help me. I laid the old brittle papers out on the dining room table. There were deeds, titles, and stacks of handwritten correspondence. And at the bottom, there was a huge rolled-up, hand-drawn survey map of the entire northern shore of the lake, dated 1958. It was a beautiful, intricate document drawn by a master surveyor from a bygone era. I was carefully unrolling it, marveling at the detail. When the courier arrived, he handed me the thick, stiff envelope. It was from the HOA's lawyers. And that's when I saw the two words that made the world drop out from under me: notice of eviction. They were claiming that the lien gave them the right, as the primary creditors, to take possession of the property to prevent further neglect and devaluation. It was a lie, a perversion of the law, but it was printed on official-looking paper. It was terrifying. And that brings us back to that moment of utter despair, me holding the eviction notice. Cynthia, across the street, watching me with her smug, victorious smile. I was at my lowest point. I was a quiet man, a grieving man, and this relentless, hateful woman had backed me into a corner from which there seemed to be no escape. That night was the longest of my life. I felt a grief so profound it was like losing my wife all over again. They were trying to erase the last sanctuary of her memory. But as the hours ticked by, as the moon traced its slow arc across the lake, the grief began to burn away, leaving something else in its place. A cold, quiet, and methodical anger. I was an archivist. My entire life had been about protecting the truth of the past from those who would ignore or rewrite it. And I was holding the truth right here on my dining room table. I turned my attention back to the old map. My grandfather hadn't just been a good businessman. He had been a man of vision. He knew the value of this land, especially the waterfront. I smoothed out the heavy paper and began to trace the property. Lines he had owned back in the 50s. There was my 1-acre plot with the cabin, clearly marked. And then my finger kept going. The line on the old map didn't stop at the edge of my yard, continued in a long, sweeping arc, right along the most desirable stretch of the lake's shore. My heart began to beat faster. I pulled up the current county tax plat map on my laptop. I compared the two. The modern map showed the HOA's lavish, multi-slip boat dock, their sandy, man-made beach, their prized lakefront common area with its picnic tables and gazebo, and the old map. The original legally filed plat map from 1958 showed that entire Favaka parcel as belonging to my grandfather, the developer, either through a colossal error or a shady, unrecorded handshake deal, had built the community's most valuable assets on land they had never, ever owned. Land that now belonged to me. The next morning, I wasn't a grieving widower anymore. I was a man with a mission.
Ow.
I took the old map to the county records office. The clerk, a wonderful woman who had been there for 40 years, remembered my grandfather. She pulled the original massive plat book from the archives. And there it was, recorded in permanent ink, clear as day. My map was authentic. It was the legally binding document. The 5 acres and everything on it was mine. I didn't just send a letter. That wasn't good enough. It required a statement. The day of my supposed eviction, I was up early. I hired a surveying crew to come out and restake the original, legally recorded property lines. Then I called a local fencing company and asked for their biggest, tallest, most industrial-grade chain-link fence. At 10 o'clock sharp, the 30-day deadline on my eviction notice, Cynthia showed up, flanked by 2 sheriff's deputies, ready to oversee my removal. Her face was a mask of grim satisfaction. But the expression began to melt as she saw the scene in front of her. The survey crew was just finishing, their bright pink flags creating a new, undeniable border. And that border ran right through the middle of the HOA's prize-winning rows. Garden cut across their perfectly manicured lawn, and went straight down to the lake, effectively cutting off the entire community from their waterfront park and their precious boat dock. And behind the surveyors, the fencing company was unloading roll after roll of 10-foot tall, commercial-grade chain link. Cynthia's face went from smug to confused to apoplectically enraged. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked. "That is HOA common property. You are destroying it. Officers, arrest this man. He's a vandal." I calmly walked over to the senior deputy, a man with a tired but steady look in his eye. I handed him a thick folder. "Good morning, officer," I said. "Before you do anything, I suggest you look at this." Inside the folder was a certified copy of the original 1958 plat map, signed and notarized letter from the county clerk, confirming its legal supremacy. And a freshly filed court order I had my lawyer get that morning, an emergency injunction against the Water's Edge Estates HOA, prohibiting them and any of their residents from setting foot on my newly restaked 5-acre private property. The deputy's eyes scanned the documents. He looked at the map. He looked at the court order. He looked at the pink flags that now surrounded the boat dock. And then he looked at me, a slow, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. I then turned to a stunned and sputtering Cynthia. "You tried to evict me from my 1-acre cabin, Cynthia," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You sent me threatening letters. You tried to place an illegal lien on my home. You made my life a living hell. And in your arrogant, desperate attempt to steal what was mine, You made me look closer at what I actually owned. I gestured to the newly marked off land. It turns out I also own this 5-acre park, your beautiful beach, and of course, your very expensive boat dock. For years, you and your entire community have been trespassing, and now the party is over. Held up the eviction notice she had sent me, and with a deep, profound sense of satisfaction, I tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter to the ground at her feet. Your eviction notice, I said, my voice ringing with a finality she couldn't ignore, is void. Now I'm going to have to ask you and all the residents of Water's Edge Estates to please get off my property. The deputies, now fully understanding the situation, informed a shell-shocked Cynthia that this was a civil matter, that the court order I held was valid, and that they could not, in fact, enforce her eviction order. They had been called under false pretenses. They tipped their hats to me and left. The community was thrown into an absolute uproar. Their primary amenity, the very thing that made their homes lakefront, the source of their inflated property values, was now legally fenced off and belonged to the quiet, grieving man they had tried to crush. Cynthia was disgraced. She was removed from the presidency in a vicious emergency meeting filled with screaming, terrified homeowners. The new board, a humbled and desperate group, approached me to negotiate. I didn't want their park or their dock. I just wanted my peace. But I also wanted justice. I became their landlord. I drafted a formal long-term lease agreement. The HOA now pays me a substantial annual fee for the use of my land. The income will secure the future of my family's cabin forever. As part of the agreement, they were also required to pay all of my legal fees and make a very large public donation to a local hospice organization in my late wife's name. This whole nightmare taught me a powerful lesson. People who are obsessed with power and control, who try to take what isn't theirs, often end up losing the very thing they thought they had. Cynthia was so focused on grabbing my little 1-acre slice of the pie that she never bothered to check the map and see who owned the whole bakery. Her greed and her cruelty were the instruments of her own downfall. The past, the dusty old documents she had no respect for, rose up and swallowed her whole. The new HOA board pays their lease on time every single month. But the new president, a slick real estate developer from the city, has just petitioned the town for a public hearing to discuss the community's urgent need for eminent domain acquisition of certain critical lakefront recreational parcels for the public good.